I think the biggest change is that suddenly machine learning stopped being a domain-specific subject. All the stuff just all gone, all replaced by three letters, LLM. It does everything, right? Which is crazy. The funny thing about large language model is it's very good at inductive learning, right? The language model basically reverse engineer the human logic behind it.
Welcome to the Alpha Intelligence Podcast. My name is Matt Robinson, founder of AI Street. Very happy to have Ben Ren with us today. He founded SigTech, which was spun out of Brevin Howard in 2019, combining a PhD in computer science trading. Joined my co-host, Francesco Fabozzi, and thanks for joining us. What I'm particularly interested in is like your background coming from computer science, AWS, systematic strategies, and now here we are with LLMs, which is totally seems like a very different beast.
Yeah. So I started building large-scale distributed systems. I think my scholarship at Cambridge was actually paid for by Intel. So Intel as a company is very close to my heart. And the company is going through some fundamental transformations under the Trump administration. Yeah. I'm actually paying a close attention to the company to see what is a good value investment or something. But I started in 2003, starting doing my research. I mean, it was 20 years ago, right? 22 years ago. It was actually the very start of cloud computing. I mean, it started with Intel making multi-core chips, right? Because before that, the race in the semiconductor industry, it really just like Intel and the AMD, each trying to up the frequency and the single core performance of the chip until they hit a ceiling. They say, oh my God, we can't just increase it 35% every year. We kind of capped out. So what do? Okay, the only way to do it is to put in one die and then 4 and 8 and 16 to scale it like that. And that actually unlocks the whole era of cloud computing. So 22 years later, Intel is in a different place and NVIDIA is the multi-trillion dollar company. The world has totally changed. I guess one common theme I see in my career is when we started, everybody spent years of training to acquire a deep kind of expertise in data analytics, be able to use different tools to analyze data. And then as time goes by, there's more data to analyze. Tools getting a bit better. We started from basic tool to Python, then to machine learning, to deep learning. But for a long time, for 20 years out of 22 years, everything was bespoke. Well, everything was specific to the problem domain. Everything has to be crafted by humans. And then 2 years ago, when large language model came about, I think the biggest change is that suddenly machine learning stopped being a domain-specific subject. In most cases, you can still build very specific neural networks to solve protein folding and everything. But for most of the previously considered narrow domain problem, it's just suddenly you get it for free. You get it for free, whether it's information retrieval or summarization or entity recognition, all of the stuff just all gone, replaced by three letters, LLM. It does everything, right? Which is crazy. And now we are looking at upgrade in the models every two months from different competing firms, which is really upping the ante every two months, which is crazy. And last year, Microsoft were pushing co-pilots, but this year is all about agents. Now we are building multi-agentic, but there's so much going on, right? So it's on one hand, very exciting. On one hand, it's almost like it's a bit too much.
Yeah. Just a couple of years ago, I remember having to get a bunch of RAs to label a bunch of data for me because we were building these narrow models. And now it's like, okay, you just get a bunch of ChatGPT output to use as your training data if you're building narrow models, which is interesting. Could you explain a little bit about SigTech and then how LLMs has changed sort of the product scope?
Yes. So we started in 2019 to focus on the quant infrastructure, right? The idea was as all the PMs, portfolio managers in hedge funds are moving up the ladder of code power, so to speak, right? But most of them, the funny thing is, not funny, the irony is the most senior PMs in hedge funds, they manage the most capital. But because of their seniority, the less likely they know how to program. Right? So if you go to the hedge fund, you see the most senior PM are surrounded by 6 screens. On the screens, all you see are Bloomberg terminals and Excel spreadsheets. Okay, you are not going to see a Jupyter notebook or Python interpreter or like a Visual Studio Code running somewhere on the screen. It does not occupy any of the screen estate. So the way they bring the analytical firepower into their team is to hire younger people who are good with Python and everything. So when we start in 2019, the idea is we are going to do pretty much the entire infrastructure and engineering for all these front office users who have to just do a lot of data analysis. So we take care of the data lake, the data ingestion, all the pipelines, but also the analytical framework, the quant pricing, different asset classes. I mean, the whole thing. The idea is the PMs and their analysts just need to focus on one thing, which is implement our ideas, test our ideas. If it's good, allocate capital to it. So that's the idea. But the one constant problem we have to solve is that the audience is in the hundreds of thousands, but still quite niche. And because of the complexity of the product, because we covered all the asset classes and we cover from simple instruments like stocks and futures to complex derivatives like swaptions and exotic options. Product is quite niche and very hard to use. And you really have to be a kind of a Python guru to use it. So when 2 years ago, large language model came about, I mean, I think my eureka moment was when I realized if I give the documentation we previously gave to our users to help them learn how to use our product, if I gave them the same manuals and tutorials to ChatGPT, it was ChatGPT 3.5 Turbo, and ask questions afterwards, oh, how do you do this? How do you do that? It was doing an okay job. It was giving sensible answers, right? So I saw that, oh my God, I mean, if we can train a large language models similar to we train a user, I guess the user don't have to, learn so much. They can just use the ChatGPT as an intermediary or analyst or co-pilot to use our product. So that's really the way we thought about tapping into the Gen AI to completely open up our target audience. And with one unforeseen consequences, which is, I think SigTech has become a living, breathing example of AI agents eating the breakfast, lunch, and dinner of a SaaS business. We basically cannibalize ourselves. So all our users are now very interested in switching over to our Gen AI product called Magic. So we have seen this paradigm shift from SaaS to Gen AI, especially AI agent kind of product. So I think the CEO of Microsoft, he mentioned something like SaaS was dead or going to die or something like that. We actually see that happening. It's just because the LLM today is getting better. It's getting so good. It completely changes the way we design products and the way we charge the whole business model. So that's a fascinating thing to see.
Wow. So how folks were obviously they couldn't use it back in 2020 without that technology, but now their preference is to use that rather than the way they were a couple of years ago.
Yeah, the large language models, I would say their performance in coding has improved probably most among all the different domains. I think there are several reasons for it. One is they found the product market fit, right? Because the early adopters of these models are developers, right? I think Cursor is the company that reaches, I think that has reached 100 million ARR in the shortest period of time in history, right? Cursor, like they got 100 million ARR like in I don't know, 9 months or something, very short period of time. This absolutely, this like they plot this graph, right? Time over.
Yeah, just straight up.
This guy like, straight up. It's like total outlier, right? But also, I think internally you have seen that too, because all our developers now today, they all use Cursor.
Yeah. Cursor user myself.
Cursor user yourself. I'm actually, it's like, I think when we started, funny enough, our most senior developers refused to use Cursor. Okay. Their reason is I have my own particular taste in code. I'm like a code connoisseur. I don't trust generated code. I want it my way, right?
Pure
My way
code.
is better, which is like, and my code is art, which is probably true. But even they have converted because they realize that even if you're creating art, you're not creating art every single minute. Okay, you are spending 80% of the time writing boilerplate, like
Right.
crawling a website, fetching some content. I mean, these are boring stuff. You don't
Right.
want to create art on that. You want to do something more unique. Even they are converted. So, but now these days we are pretty much anything boilerplate, one shot, pretty much perfect. Anything specific to our own business logic, because now for example, 2 days ago, the Cross 3.7 saw that it can load our entire code base into its context window. So if you're given, so even the code we write for ourselves is private. We can still use the LLM to refactor it, to debug it, to optimize it, to clean it up, because sometimes when we write it, the structure is not exactly the most elegant way. It's actually incredible, right? Now we cannot live without it. But this is a story to corroborate the fact that our users of our SaaS product, I mean, they realize that it's much easier to use large language models which have access to like over 1,000 APIs in our framework. So I think even good programmers, they realize they have better things to do and they can really trust LLM these days.
Yeah, it's funny. It just made me think. For instance, the New York Times, they just released a whole bunch of products for their journalists for SEO and like certain things. And I'm like, and I kind of had the same reaction too when I first started playing with them. Be like, oh, I write better, or I can. And now I just use it all the time. I'm like, give me 10 different headlines, or I want a verb that like this. And it's funny. Like I would think there's going to be probably know that a lot of journalists are going to be like reluctant, but once they start using it, they're going to be like, oh, this is, to your point. They're like, a lot of the times they're double checking something. It's not the fun part. You're automating a lot of the stuff you don't want to do.
Yeah. So in terms of the product, how good were these models in terms of like were you able to just prompt engineer, or did you have to do any sort of fine tuning component for your specific needs?
So currently, our Gen AI product, we call it Magic. So Magic stands for Multi-Agent Investment Copilot. I really wanted to get rid of the Copilot bit because it's very 2024. We haven't found a good replacement for C. Maybe Collaborator or something. Well, we have to see what's the right word for 2025. So Magic, what we build is it's a multi-agent product. So the idea is the user interfacing with AI chief of staff. And the chief of staff is like the team leader or maybe the conductor of a AI orchestra. So the chief of staff interfaces with a team of AI agents who are specialists. So we have built dozens of AI specialist agents for different things, for analyzing central banks, for analyzing to web-based research, similar to the deep research and from OpenAI and from Grok. We have built agents to do actually commercial loan underwriting, which is like a whole new story in itself. We have built agents to analyze like companies' investor relations documents, which is surprisingly fruitful, but also surprisingly hard for different reasons. So the idea is when the user want to carry out a research or start a project, they discuss it with the chief of staff. Then chief of staff use the information to create a plan. And then the plan is made up of a lot of tasks. The task can be a linear list of tasks. It could be something that can branch. So it can be quite complex to a graph. And the tasks are assigned to the most qualified AI agents. And they then can work on these different tasks, sometimes in parallel. In the end, everything can teamwork, put together, and then generate a holistic response. So that's our product. So the reason we go down this path is, I think the multi-agent framework is almost certainly is the right design choice. Mainly because in practice we need quite often it's very difficult to use only one agent to do everything, because agents is far more than just a chatbot. It has access to tools, and it has access to different private data sets. It's very difficult. If you imagine there are, say, 1,000 different tools, if you put all these tools, give all these tools to one agent and give like 100 data sets to one agent. So when you ask a question, the agent basically has to select the right tools out of 1,000 and select the right data sets to access out of 100. The complexity is like combinatorial, right? Whereas you break it down and say, hey, actually this 1,000 data set can be broken down into different 100 different categories. 10 is financial, 10 is text. Basically, then you assign an agent to only look over a small subset of the tools and data. Then the complexity in terms of tool selection and chain them together to correctly, it goes down substantially, right? So it's almost like conceptually a parallel to the modular design of software, monolithic versus modular. That's why we say we really believe in this multi-agent design. We don't currently fine-tune the LLMs for agent, but each agent we actually very carefully select the right model for them, given their domain of expertise. If it's relatively simple, we don't have to go crazy and use like O1 or something. If it's but if it's very complex, we'll probably have to go with O1 or O3 mini something. But very recently, I mean, up until like 3 months ago, I would say the OpenAI models pretty much dominate pretty much almost everywhere. But recently we have found very nice use cases where the Gemini 2.0, Flash 2.0 Pro models actually excel and surpass performance of the models from OpenAI and Claude. So suddenly today we have agents that are powered by literally by Anthropic, by Gemini, and by OpenAI. I think that's another thing really good about the multi-agent design is that you are able to choose the best model for the agent to do the best work, instead of being constrained by, say, hey, ChatGPT will only have one model, one agent, one company. I feel like they really give the customers the best experience.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And so on that note, how do you go about, since Magic is very complex, multifaceted product, how do you go about evaluating performance when the new stream of models come out? How do you gauge, is this better? Is this doing better than previous versions?
Yes, great question. The eval of the LLM is a fascinating domain by itself, right? There are some tools we can use. So because we focus on capital markets, our job is to, the Magic's job is to, the way we pitch it is to distill some of the asset knowledge from human experts. For example, this idea about we are working with the UK British commercial bank to completely change the way they do commercial loan underwriting is because currently the whole process is done by humans, right? I personally find this extremely fascinating because the process can be described as intellectual but not creative, boring, but still require a lot of brain power. But it's boring. You're not going to wake up every day, get excited about it to get out of bed for it. Sure, but not creative. Manual, which means had to be done by a human. Manual, but also very high value. I mean, every loan they end up underwriting, it makes a lot of money, right? Lots of money. It's very high value. So that big number, dollar or pound number attached to it. Intellectual, but not creative. Manual, but high value. It's a very kind of interesting. So these processes, I think, are everywhere in many industries, especially in capital markets. So we are working with our clients and the team in a very close collaboration to say, hey, well, all this, what we call the tacit knowledge, right? Basically the human judgment, call it experience, call it feelings, gut feelings, instincts, whatever, right? I think previously the technology was only used to codify explicit knowledge. So we have the knowledge that we can write down in steps. Then we can write it in Python. If we write it down in steps, we can write it in Python. That's basically more or less how it works. but there's so much in our head we cannot codify because it's too maybe too nebulous. But today, the funny thing about large language model is it's very good at inductive learning, right? I.e., it's very good at learning from examples. It's like few thoughts, right? So because it has such a good foundation of generalist knowledge, in large language model, if you give it like say a dozen or maybe a few dozen of examples, the language model basically reverse engineer the human logic behind it. It can distill that decision-making process out of examples. This is the input, output. And after like 20 times, it basically said, I got it. Okay. Give me some new test cases. Let me show you how it works. We are basically going through this process to distill these processes into multi-agent workflows. And therefore, we see the processing time going from, say, 6 or 8 hours of human efforts to 1 or 2 minutes. And in many businesses, this 200 times of improvement is A, unprecedented, and B, incredibly powerful, because the idea you can generate a response to a high-value transaction within minutes, but your competitors may be on holiday or the earliest will be like 6 hours later. Whoever has this technology, essentially you are going to own the market. So own the entire market. And then people will always come to you for a quote because they get in 2 minutes, where other people are still wait 8 hours. But we see opportunity like this everywhere.
I just wanted to like highlight that because, you know, I think what your point about induction and deductive logic, right? Because it reminds me of my practical logic days back in college. Basically, it figures out deduction through massive amounts of induction, right? Like you just give it a million layer, tons and tons of examples, and it'll figure out the rules. Whereas that previously was, we figure out the rules and then we tell the machine. Now the machine's like, we'll figure out the rules.
Absolutely right.
It's just such a switch.
Such a switch. Absolutely. And that's what makes it so versatile. You know, so versatile. And the truth is, a lot of the tacit knowledge is not really, it's tested because people don't know how to write it down. Yeah. It's like actually there's so much knowledge. If you think about it, it's unrecorded, right? It's like, because therefore we call them experience or whatever, gut feeling or whatever it is, but it's not written down. It's probably quite difficult to write it down, but it's okay. Because as long as we can compile input, output by human experts, input, output, and after a few dozen or maybe a few hundred, the machine will essentially inductively figure it out.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Can you talk? You were talking about this prospective bank client. Can you talk about your mix of clients and how that's evolved? Also, I want to hear about like, you were in the hedge fund space. What are your old colleagues? I'm sure you were like, when it came out, like, what's this all about? What does this mean for me? So I'm just kind of curious. It feels like this year, the last few months, there's just more, obviously there's a lot of media attention on it, but there's like, I think more practical use cases coming out.
Yeah. So we focus on 3 main categories of clients. Number one is macro hedge funds. That's just because I come from Bremen Howard. Therefore, I know the field, the domain pretty well. We know for macro hedge fund, we focus on essentially micro research. Right? A very simple use case would be, not simple actually, a quite typical use case would be, when you're a macro hedge fund, you only worry about 2 things really. Actually, you worry about many things, but start with 2 things. The first thing is, what has the market priced in? I.e., what does the market know? Because that's really you really need to know, right? Because for example, you look at the yield curve, you look at the swaps, FX market, very liquid. It's priced in a lot of information, but you really, as a trader, need to know what's priced in. What's the market view as of now? And the way to have that market view is essentially to read, well, every single research piece coming out of the sell side or boutique research houses, because everybody read it, right? Everybody have access to it, and then they got priced into the market. But the problem with this is that you are receiving something like 20 PDFs every day, and 20 pages to 40 pages each, and you're not going to read them. And even if you read all of them, you almost certainly will not remember most of them. And even if you remember all of them, all you have got so far is the baseline, what the market knows. Then you come to the second point, which is, okay, what I know a bit different that allows me to structure a trade and make a bet, right? If a market believes A, I believe slightly different, okay, and I think I'm right, how do I structure a trade out of it? So the second point is like, okay, what do I know a bit different? So what we work with the micro hedge fund basically to help them very quickly understand what the market has priced in, so they can focus on what they actually know that's different, if any. So they can focus on structured trade and put on trade. So that's our first category. Second category, the third category is the UK commercial banks. But the second category, I would say, is the equity fund managers, which I have to say, I have again, I feel very close to, because when I got interested in finance, I was Warren Buffett and value investing. But in some sense, I think the active investing or active management in equities is dying in some sense in the last 10, 15 years. There are tens of trillions of capital going to passive. And passive, by definition, does not contribute to price discovery. We rely on stock pickers for price discovery, but they are losing tens of trillion assets. Not really great. And then we have this concentration, right? It's like today, the top 26 stocks, they are accountable for half of the S&P 500 market cap. We can maybe just barely name those 26, but we can definitely not name the other 474.
Right.
But again, but the issue here is, let's say, compare NVIDIA, a multi-trillion dollar company, with a multi-billion dollar company. It does not take 1,000 times more efforts to analyze NVIDIA versus a unicorn. It's not 1,000 times. Okay, it has to be. It's roughly in the same magnitude. There may even be an argument that it may take more efforts to analyze a smaller company because it's a bit more opaque. You have to go and look for information. So you see the problem. The problem is, you can spend 26 units of efforts analyzing 26 companies and then be able to deploy tens of billions of capitals. You can spend 474 units of time, efforts, analyzing those smaller companies, but you don't get to deploy the same amount of capital. It's just not worth it. It's just because it's so hard. It's not scalable, right? So the number of equity analysts has gone down by over a third in the last 15 years. But even Warren Buffett in 96, right? The value investing is literally dying, literally, right? So I think, what we are working with the equity fund managers is to basically, their job is really, really hard. So we essentially build the entire AI research team for them. And our current client asked us to analyze a public company. And then our AI agents basically put on every single piece of investor relations document going back 15 years. It's about 2 million words. And then the CIO asks one question. It's like, okay, now this company made a lot of investments over the years. Tell me every year what kind of investment they had to write down. And for each write down, how much they write down, what's the initial investment thesis, what changed, yada, yada. We generate a report about 25 pages going back 15 years, detailing every single write down in about just under 10 minutes by processing about 2 million words. 2 million words. The 2 million words, it just gives people some idea about what 2 million words mean. One piece by Tolstoy in English is about 600,000 words. Okay, it's like 600,000 words. So 2 million words is about 16 times. No, sorry, I'm doing the wrong math. 1.6 times. So it's almost like just a bit less than two war and peace. Multiple agents read it in under 10 minutes and generates the most comprehensive report for this one company. So I think that's where we are going, right? Otherwise, I would argue the capital markets are becoming less and less efficient. They're not enough.
Yeah. That's really interesting. SigTech is more for systematic, but with the LLMs, have you seen a shift in sort of your customer demographics and more of these discretionary managers just looking to get access to quick information?
Yes, exactly. And And I would say, I think the another thing I would say is with the large language models becoming so good at so many things, I would even see the systematic specialists, they're getting kind of a squeeze. There are quite a lot more things they felt they had an edge in, because they felt only they could do, but non-systematic guys couldn't do. But that domain is shrinking, right? So in some sense, we are pushing the systematic investors or traders to be more and more hardcore, right?
Yeah.
To gravitate toward the most difficult, most hardcore domain that haven't been encroached upon by large language models. Whereas the rest of the traders, the investors, they have been expanding their domains with the help of large language models. It's a very interesting dynamic.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense because systematic strategies a lot, or what I'm very familiar with is like a lot of Fama French and these factor modeling. And that seems like it's just a way of characterizing a company with numerical values, because you can't really focus on the whole cross section of stocks as a discretionary trader. So the systematic traders have an advantage in that they can sort of characterize a company and its future performance with these financial variables. But now these discretionary analysts who would spend time on these top 26 stocks or however many stocks, now they're able to actually do this more systematic sort of search across many different stocks and apply the strategies that they're analyzing for a certain stock to many more. So they're able to cover much more stocks. So it's very interesting that LLMs are now enabling this. And that's a good take that it's potentially squeezing out some of these systematic managers.
Exactly.
You've spoken previously about like how asking the right questions is sort of the path rather than seeking these solutions. So I was just curious if you could talk about that.
Yeah. So first, think about how would a human analyst answer this question? Let's say your CIO asks you, okay, tell me every single write-down by this company in the last 15 years. There are about 135 documents coming in different shape and form. Some PDF, some are scripts, like earnings call scripts, some are CEO statements, some are very colorful graphic presentations, some are Excel spreadsheets. I remember it's 135 documents. So human analysts basically have to open up 135 files. In each file, you have to Command S if you use Mac to do some kind of a keyword search, right? You are going to search write down, or you're going to search impairment, or whatever synonym they come up with. And for every time that keyword appears, you have to read that particular sentence or paragraph to see whether it's related to your question or not. If it is, okay, and you have to move the mouse cursor, select that paragraph, Command C copy, and then Command V paste into a note, and you do it for every single document of the 135, and they have a note, okay? And they have the note, you have to write something cohesive out of this, right? And also there are spreadsheets. So this is weeks of work, right? It's just weeks of work. I mean, I think if you think about it, it fits exactly with what we described before. It's intellectual, but not necessarily creative. It's very manual, but extremely high value. It just takes weeks.
Yeah.
It's really, really hard. It was impossible to do until now. Now it's doing, the LLM are capable of doing with the right design and prompts and everything and tools. We're doing an amazing job. In terms of I think the question solution, this is a very incredibly insightful question. Actually, not previously. Up to this point, our job as a human is to provide answers. I mean, that's what we pay. That's what we are paid for. We got told to do things. We come up with our solution and answer. We got paid. Okay, happy days. But now the role of the user is changing, because now you're working with magic. You're working with the army of AI agents. So you are no longer the analyst. Everybody is the director in some sense. You know that if most of us used to be PhD students, now every single one of us are now supervisors, right?
Yeah.
You just supervise an army of AI PhDs doing your job. So that's quite a fundamental change in our role and how we approach our job. And it's actually also very different skill sets, right? It's all, I mean, maybe a more romantic or dramatic analogy would be the transition from a violinist to a conductor. It's a totally different job. It's a very different job, right? So, I mean, but that's happening to everybody. I think by the end of this year, maybe end of next year, and this kind of magic-like applications start to take over, every one of us will have to change how we work every day. It's very different skill sets.
One thing we didn't talk too much about DeepSeek yet, but can you talk a bit about the cost of compute and like the cost of how much? I think this is somewhat, I don't know, underreported, or regardless of what happens to these frontier models, the cost to use them is going down, and it's going down pretty dramatically. Can you talk about like what that means for SigTech Magic, where you see things going? I don't know. It's hard to go 5 years out, but maybe 1 or 2 years out.
Maybe 5 weeks out. I think the hardware cost is coming down about an inference cost, but mainly it's hardware cost. It's about 10 times every year. 10 times every year, which is dramatic because in Moore's law previously, it doubles every 18 months. Now we are talking about 10 times lower inference cost every year. That's really dramatic. But then there's another 10 times of improvements that will come out of the engineering side of things, like the algorithm optimization, like the training system design. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of nodes, right, speaking to each other, how a network and memory utilization and network latency. There's a lot of engineering that can be optimized, which is the thing that DeepSeek did very well, that allowed them to essentially train their model from scratch at a fraction of the costs. So these two mega trends, 10 times of improvement of hardware, 10 times of improvement of engineering efficiency, we're probably looking at another 100x reduction per unit of output, per unit of intelligence output. So we are really very, very quickly get to a point where intelligence is a bit like electricity. It's untapped. In some sense,
it's wild to think about, but yeah.
Yeah. And I would argue intelligence within by the end of next year will be more universally available on tap than beer.
Right.
So then, but this brings me to another kind of an important point, which is actually go back in time and look at how much we spend on electricity from the industrialization in Britain, the steam power, then the electrification. Funny enough, I saw a pattern which is in the last 100 years, every country every year spent roughly 1% of their GDP related to 1% of GDP on power grid, expansion and maintenance, 1% GDP. And that's the same in Britain, same in the US, same in China over the years. That seems to be a pattern. It's something so fundamental, such big part of our infrastructure, we spend about 1% of GDP. Now the US GDP is just under $30 trillion. 1% is 300 billion. And coincidentally, the big tech have announced almost spend on $300 billion of spending into AI data centers in 2025. So we are literally spending about 1% of GDP already into Gen AI. Therefore, I don't think the Gen AI is being hyped per se. If anything, it's in line. That the argument could be a bit more at the beginning, tend to the investment to be slightly higher than 1%. So we're in line in the historical context. So there's some people have been saying, oh my God, tens of billions, now hundreds of billions is high, it's overhyped. If anything, I feel like it's a bit underhyped. I think, and the cost is coming down and investment going in. I feel like the transformational impact is coming so fast at us, right? People like us may spend hours every day reading news, thinking about this, talking about this, but I think we are still very much the minority, right? Maybe most people are very far removed from this.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to imagine what will happen when the entire society had to face the dramatic impact of this revolution just all in one go. It's very difficult to imagine.
I'm curious if you see any parallels with the adoption of cloud computing? Because I'm old enough to remember, like back in the 2010s, companies were like, "Oh, we're not gonna. It's too risky to sort of keep things out there, not on site." So I'm just curious to your point about, because I agree with you. I think this is very early. Most people are completely unaware of the pace. I mean, even experts like yourself, I talk to all the time, and they are surprised by how quickly things are moving. So I was just curious if you see any parallels between the two.
I think the cloud computing took 20 years, maybe 20 years. I think the reason it took 10, 20 years is because for enterprise to move from a bespoke in-house data center kind of bare-bone server infrastructure to a cloud-hosted infrastructure, it's just very expensive because you basically have to retool everything, right? We coming from the software background, like when you are all your infrastructure is running on bespoke server setup and you rewrite it to fit into AWS, it just takes years. But also in B2B, right? And so when you migrate, you have to run two copies at the same time. You have to compare the results to make sure everything line up. And it just takes a lot of time. I think the Gen AI will be substantially faster because it's less about a B2B kind of infrastructure transformation. It's more like I feel like it's going to happen more on the application layer, right? And at the application layer, therefore, there are less this kind of constraints about moving the infrastructure. It's about applications. And then I feel like because it's the agentic design, it's going to make it feel like very similar, very quickly, very similar to speaking to AI agents would be very similar to speaking to a colleague. Frankly, there's no, for example, I can be having, I think by the end of this year, maybe certainly next year, I could be having a Zoom call with two AI agents of you representing you. I wouldn't be able to tell the difference, right? And when you're messaging your colleagues on Slack, you assume today, naturally, it's the human on the other side,
Right.
on the other end giving you an answer. But if it's an AI agent giving you a sensible answer, I don't think we will be able to tell the difference. What I'm trying to say is the application will be able to change the impact of our work without fundamentally change our user experience. We can still have this similar user experience, whereas everything else has already changed. So therefore, combine these 2 points, I feel like the adoption will be way faster. But so far, to be fair, we haven't seen a major adoption in the enterprise environment yet. It's more about B2C. But if B2C adoption curve has been any indicator relative to the historically the B2C application, the Cursor and ChatGPT, I think the adoption will be much faster
Yeah.
than ever before.
So to piggyback on that point on a slightly more boring note, so have you encountered any of your clients who have concerns about the API based approach of magic, let's say? And then at any certain points, have you considered running your own inference and what that sort of implies, all of the specialized infrastructure and really the software as well to deploy these models and get output fast?
Yeah. So our client definitely worry about data privacy because all these workflow, they process sensitive private documents. So we have to assure them that the data privacy, the governance, for example, we use the OpenAI models hosted in Azure. So there are protections. They are not being used for training, the other purposes. It's a very important box to tick. In terms of hosting our own models, I think it's going to happen. I think because there are 2 reasons. One is just open source models are becoming extremely competitive, such as DeepSeek and other variations. So it's much cheaper. And also we can customize them, right? So you mentioned, Francesco, you mentioned the fine tuning. It will become a very powerful tool for specific domains. The other reason we will start hosting our own model is because I think small language models will be very useful in a multi-agentic framework. When we have an agent doing very specific things, we can actually distill from a large language model into a small language model, because when the agent is doing very specific long underwriting, it doesn't really need to understand the nuances of Julius Caesar and Cicero in Roman history. So,
Yeah.
so I think there's that. Therefore, I think that I'm excited by the possibilities of all these different branches of development in the technology. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the inference will getting this software up to the point where we can easily sort of apply inference on these models, quantize them, and apply them in some sort of systems that are specializing in inference will be huge. That's like sort of part of my research in a debate I had on a panel at a conference the other day was these these small models can sometimes do better. They exactly don't need to know literature to be able to, for example, perform sentiment. So that's one of the things that I look at is whether you need a chat GPT for sentiment analysis, or you could use one of these small narrow models that are just trained on human annotated examples. So yeah, I think it's very exciting as we get better inference out of these models.
Ben, I already asked you to predict the future, but do you have any any other final thoughts on the space?
I think I would probably finish by making a comment on, I think what will become more and more valuable in the near future. I think knowledge in some sense will become less valuable because it's easily accessible, right? So we spend years in education learning the knowledge, but if the knowledge is just like one ChatGPT / Claude / DeepSeek / Grok 3 away, how do we think about education? How do we think about knowledge? I feel like having knowledge is probably become less valuable, has to be a bit more selective. But on the other hand, I think experiences will become increasingly valuable, because if I say I experienced some color that no one else has talked about because I don't know, and I mean, I just feel like experiences cannot be replicated, by definition. So I think humans as a society may gravitate towards pursuing more enriching, fulfilling, novel experiences. And I think about when large language model can write all the code, but I'm not sure today that large language models have good taste. I don't think the training of the large language model today, when it comes to coding, is more on the correctness. I don't think the reinforced learning, the post-training has taken into account taste, right? So does this mean that human will play an important role in beauty, but less about correctness? I think that's quite interesting. Human may still be the leader in taste and beauty, and machine can do the thing correctly, I guess. But I think there's a fundamental shift in what we value, what we don't value. I just finished with an interesting story because I find it very interesting, which is like someone told me this story. It's like candles used to be extremely expensive because only the richest people could afford candles and to have light. And then with electricity and light bulbs, everybody has light. So the candle become really cheap because it's useless. And then electricity really became universal. Candles become expensive again because it become a luxury goods. So if you go to someone's house and you see 300 candles around the place, this person got money because he literally has the money to burn. Okay, so I feel like this is a very interesting story anecdote, because I think as society goes through such dramatic changes, things we value come and go. Very exciting time ahead.
I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm pretty sure our listeners will as well. Ben, thanks very much for joining us. And thanks you as well, Francesco. I'll see you next time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.